Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about threats to the connected airplane, and I want to distinguish threats from failures. Failures are things that break because we didn't want them to break. Threats are things that break because we wanted them to break, through malicious action typically. Airworthiness security is focused mostly on the ability to connect into a system through electronic interaction. So it's all about connectivity. How do you assess threats? There's all sorts of different kinds of threats. Denial of service, or basically all the kinds of hacking exploits that you've heard about. But they involve really three major components: the confidentiality of the information, the integrity of the information, has it been corrupted, and the availability of the function itself, the loss of the function. So those are the three areas that we focus on. Assessing threats follows something very similar to what we do with failure analysis, where we judge the hazard in 5 different grades. And they follow from no effect all the way up through minor, major, hazardous, up to catastrophic threats. And these are familiar to us, I think, from the failure modes. To put those in context, something that would take away a non-safety radio, like a Ku-Ka-band SATCOM system, has no effect on the aircraft's safe operation, and it's not dependent on that in any way. If you take safety data link away, so the L-band SATCOM system goes down and you don't have ACARs out over the ocean, that has a minor effect on the airplane. If you deliver data link messages to a pilot and you've changed those messages and you don't know that those messages have been changed, that actually is a major failure, the corruption of data or misleading data. There's been, a lot of emphasis in the news recently about flight controls failures, and in fact, when we talk about these threats, they can touch flight controls. It's one of the areas that we're most concerned about. These are stepping into a more severe scenario. So a loss of a flight control system is going to have a major hazardous effect. A single flight control system, the airplanes are designed generally with accommodations around loss of a single flight control system. As you start to have multiple flight control systems break, of course, then you can move up the chain. And if flight control systems are operating in a manner that you don't expect, if you push the yoke forward but the airplane goes up or something like that, that type of a threat can be very, very dangerous and can take you up a level. So, generally, loss is one level of a problem, but misleading data or malfunction ratchets up the hazard by one step. So the severity of the threat, which we talked about, sort of increases in this table from the left to the right. And then in the failure analysis, we talk about the frequency, 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 5, numbers like that. In the threat analysis, it's not done quite numerically. They talk at extremely low up to very high. Very high being something that's going to happen. There's very high likelihood of that exploit being occurred. Extremely low being something that you wouldn't expect it to happen. And if you look at hazards that have no safety effect or a minor effect, in the area of security, that's acceptable. So it's acceptable to corrupt a system that has a minor hazard. This is out of DO 356A, the information that I'm talking about right now. When you deal with a hazard that has a major effect, now suddenly you don't accept that happening as frequently, and so you have to expect that there are mitigations in place to prevent that. So the likelihood or the level of threat, the frequency of that is going to go down. So in this case, a very high or high likelihood of those threats is not allowed for something that would have a major failure. Similarly, as you move up to hazardous, again, you're not notching it down, and all the way down to catastrophic. And generally, catastrophic requires a combination of threats, so it's not one single threat that can get you there. We have design assurance level in the failure world. Here we have the security assurance level, SAL, and they're graded from 0 to 3. 0, there is no appreciable benefit. There's no barrier, if you will, up to 3, which is a very compelling barrier. And we apply those barriers selectively to those threats. Trustworthiness. So in the world of security, trust is really a bad thing in general because it's a tenuous existence, if you will. But in general, if you trust something, then it doesn't represent a threat to you. Humans are difficult to trust. They have temptation, they make mistakes, and it's probably the most difficult of all mitigations to manage is the human itself. So if you look at trustworthiness, and this is again out of DO 356, the guidance on this is that we can trust certain organizations. This isn't, in DO 356, before they revised it to A, we actually had grades on how trustworthiness we had, but now it's basically you're either trusting or you're not. And so we trust aircraft manufacturers, we trust the airlines, we trust the suppliers, we trust the MROs, and again, this is in the area of security. We trust the flight crew. We trust data that comes to us over a secure data link system, a safety data link channel. We don't trust data that comes to us over an insecure channel. So in general, if it's coming in over the internet, it's coming in over a cellular data link, that data is not necessarily to be trusted. And we don't trust the passengers. Sorry. Wireless communication is very difficult to secure. Because you just need to be in the vicinity of a wireless communication to both hear it and to be able to interject your own information to substitute for the actual communications. And there's a whole bunch of exploits related to wireless communications. So anytime you have a system connected to a wireless network, you have to be a little bit more concerned about that. Airplanes rely on surfaces around the airplane, on the wing and the tail and so forth, to maintain the level of flight and to be able to control it. This is called flight controls. And this is a synoptic off an airplane that shows all the flight controls are doing well. The system in normal mode. This is a good day. This is a sunny day scenario. This is not a sunny day scenario. Now your flight control systems are failed in some manner. They're not operating the way you expect, and you've fallen back into maybe a secondary mode. So this certainly increases pilot workload, and it creates potentially more hazardous scenarios. So it's very serious to interact in any way with flight control systems. How does this play into this? Today, the modern airplanes use a digital data link to interconnect their flight control systems. And we call it fly-by-wire, but really it's fly-by-Ethernet. Okay, so we're talking about effectively a digital data link that we're familiar with. Now, it's not the Ethernet that you're most familiar with, what we would call carrier-sensed multiple access or CSMA-type Ethernet. It's a thing called time-triggered protocol Ethernet, or TTP in this case. And that was defined in AIRWORTHINESS 664 Part 7. And because of the nature of these components, they have to be developed to a very high assurance level. And in this case, this example you can see was developed to a level A standard, which is the highest standard for development. Time-triggered protocol is a generic industry name. There is a branded name, you may be familiar with it, AFDX. That's a patented name that comes out of Airbus, but it's really the same style of protocol. It's a time-triggered protocol for Ethernet. Whenever you have an airplane that has the ability to communicate in some way off board or has these Ethernet networks on board the aircraft, there are no fixed rules per se. You have to prove to the regulator that you have developed a system that is secure. And so you have issue papers. You have to provide a background and convince the regulator that you've thought through your design and your architecture, and you've looked kind of to the life cycle of the airplane as far as how it's going to go into service. And this is really important when you look at systems that have data networks like I talked about that are required for safe operations, so the flight controls networks themselves. Anything that communicates off board is something that you have to protect or be aware of. And when you bring new security measures to the airplane, how are you going to show that they're compliant? Are they really doing what they're supposed to do? So these issue papers are effectively the burden on your shoulders to convince the regulator you've thought through this thoroughly, and they make a judgment whether you've got it right or not, and if you don't, you have to go back and keep working on that. So I'm sure we've all heard about AIRCARS. I'm glad to say that it's up and running. Today, you may have seen that it's the backbone, if you will, for the FANS service that includes controller pilot, data link communication, CPDLC, ADSC, automatic dependent surveillance, contract-based. And in the U.S., for example, the next-gen data link system, departure clearance and such, those are all based on AIRCARS. AIRCARS came into service in 1978, and it really hasn't changed that much. I started sending AIRCARS messages myself in 1989. I've been doing it for 30 years, and I can tell you today I can look at an AIRCARS message with what I learned in 1989, and I can still understand it. I can still interact with it. It really has not changed dramatically. We've extended the message set, if you will, but the basic protocol has stood up. This was a slide out of a presentation back in 2014. It highlighted the fact that AIRCARS messaging was not designed for network security. AIRCARS messaging was designed around failure modes to make sure that it could get through securely over a wireless data link, that you might drop a bit or things like that. That's what it's designed for, but it wasn't really designed for dealing with malicious threats. So it's a bit of an exposed data link for us, and we can't really fix AIRCARS very easily. So we have to look to do something around AIRCARS. And so here's it's maybe a little small to read, but there's a router on board the aircraft, and it's communicating to the VHF radio or the L-band SATCOM systems, or even HF for that matter, and sending AIRCARS messages. This is sort of your native AIRCARS system. That's what we started with back in 1978. What we're doing now in the last few years, it's really taken a hold, is we're moving into a thing called AIRCARS over IP. Well, AIRCARS over IP is all about putting your message in an envelope and sealing it and sending it over an IP data link. So the idea is that the AIRCARS message itself, we can't do much around the message itself, but we can put it in an envelope and we can protect that envelope. We can tell if the envelope's been opened, we can tell where the envelope came from, and so we can provide security around the AIRCARS message, but not the AIRCARS message itself. So the mechanism for delivering or transporting that can be secured, and we can do this over really any data link once we've got that envelope in place. And this can include cellular data link on the ground, and as we go forward, you'll see the potential for shifting maybe some of the AIRCARS messages over the non-safety radio links like KE or K-band SATCOM, where the costs are quite a bit lower. Of course, we can't leave things alone. So in order to kind of look forward to how we want to make things work, we've developed a thing called the Internet Protocol Suite, IPS. And this is the AIRCARS over IP designed for safety data link. So this is not the protocol that we would use for airplane health monitoring. This is the protocol we would use for controller pilot data link communications primarily. And it involves, the idea here is to use the applications that sit in the flight management system and not ask them to change because it's very expensive to change them, to use the onboard aircraft systems, again, not changing them as much as possible, and then the IP data link radios, and for the most part, not changing them. And so there's this middleware, IPS, that sits in between and provides effectively the enveloping function that I was talking about, as well as mobility management and such. So IPS is the future for safety data link messages. It's got a little bit of a long lead time on it. In the meantime, AIRCARS over IP or generic AIRCARS over IP will fill the gap. Maintaining order. This is very important for us. We have to have a structure on board the aircraft, and it gets down to what we would call isolation between networks. In the ARINC world, ARINC 664 Part 5 brought forth this concept, and it wasn't original, it came to them, of 4 different domains on board the aircraft. The first domain, the aircraft control domain, or ACD, this is where AIRCARS sits for air traffic services or for operational communications, which are considered safety, but also your flight control networks and such, they all sit in the ACD, and that's a very protected domain. There's quite a bit of emphasis on the perimeter around that. The next domain going down is Aircraft Information Services, or AISD. This is where your electronic flight bag would sit. This is where your airplane health monitoring would sit. So these are messages that aren't germane necessarily to the safe operation of the aircraft. I'll talk about EFB shortly. But, and so there's sort of a line or delineation that says, in the ACD, we're definitely dealing with safety, at least in the area of data link. But on the anything below that, we're talking about non-safety. And non-safety is important because it allows us to use things like KU, K-band radio data link instead of the more expensive L-band or VHF data links. I'm a KU, K-band guy, I guess, so you've probably gotten that idea. In-flight entertainment, this is the Passenger Information and Entertainment Services, PIESD. This is different from the AISD. So AISD is kind of the avionics, if you will, that are part of the airplane. PIESD is strictly in-flight entertainment. It's a very big system, by the way. It's very complex and capable, in many ways leading edge in hardware and so forth. And then connected to that is the passenger-owned devices, or PODD. So these are devices that you bring on board the aircraft, your laptop or your iPad or your phone, and you're connecting it over Wi-Fi to the onboard network. And we have to treat that domain a little differently from everything else on board the aircraft because of the threats that it offers and some of the services as well that we want to provide. So these 4 domains are intended to be isolated from each other. We don't want traffic to move between those domains as much as possible. We put barriers in place and we make sure that if any traffic goes through, that it's highly managed. Back to trust. Basically, the trustworthiness only moves downwards. So or maybe to the left, I guess. But the ACD, for example, doesn't trust anything from any of the lower domains. AISD theoretically can trust the traffic that comes down from ACD if for whatever reason it's provided, but it wouldn't trust anything on the PIESD. So the trustworthiness basically follows the same, schedule you'd expect. The secret sauce for cybersecurity is cryptography. These are the keys, the technology that provides security. This is how we provide integrity and authentication. No longer do we have just passwords and things like that. So cryptography is the secret sauce for cybersecurity. And I highly encourage you to move forward in the area of cryptography and move away from passwords that everybody uses the same password logging in. Defense in depth, very briefly, the idea is that you have barriers that are successive, so you have to cross those barriers one after the other in order to get to the protected assets, not one hop, but 2 or 3. Project paper 848 out of the AWEC expresses 3 different barriers. The bottom is a commercial or off-the-shelf layer. This is where you have your basic firewalls and things like that. In 848, they're expressing a network layer component. This is a VPN that extends from the airplane to the enterprise, allows us to ensure that the airplane's connecting to the right facility. And then the application has to provide its own security. It has to make sure that the data it's receiving is from whom they expect and that data hasn't been corrupted. And the application has to do that itself. It can't trust the layers below it to do that for it. This gets to assurance levels. This is Pandora, and that's Pandora's box, although it appears it actually might have been a jar. And as you know, Pandora opened that box and let out all the evils. And with that in mind, I'd like to talk about the electronic flight bag. So within the EFB, there right now in the current state of events, this is AC 120-76D. We have Type A applications, which have no safety effect at all. And then we have Type E applications, which have a failure condition classification considered minor. Now, I'm a certification guy, so some of this stuff sort of throws me into a tilt. So just bear with me as I go through this. Boeing provides an iPad application. I went to the iPad application store, and I didn't download it, but there it is, the onboard performance tool from the Boeing company. And what does it do? It does a bunch of things, but it includes computing takeoff and landing numbers. Airbus has a very similar product, FlySmart, and again, if you look at it, it performs takeoff and landing performance numbers. So this is from the Canadian Certification Authority, their AC 700-020, and they talk about portable EFBs, which is really where we're going with EFBs by and large. This is your iPad, basically, on board the aircraft. And they can host, they're portable devices, they can host Type A and Type B applications. And this is where I go into tilt. Portable EFBs are not part of the airplane configuration, are not subject to normal airworthiness requirements and design control, and are considered as PEDs, or passenger electronic devices. So EFBs have the ability to support up to minor hazards, but they're not certified in the manner that we're used to. So this is like a distortion field, if you will, for certification. EFBs live in a very unusual state. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go quick here. As I mentioned earlier, there's two kinds of minor and no safety effect applications in there. And as I said earlier, you actually don't have to have a compelling security assurance level around that. So we actually get quite a bit of relief for that. No protective effect required. So this is how the EFB is able to accommodate those applications. The one thing that was left in Pandora's box, by the way, was hope. And that's very applicable to the EFB. There's an ecosystem around the EFB. There's a very rich one. The green bar talks about the hardware itself and the applications. And in the red line, we talk about the equipment that's installed on board the aircraft, the avionics. And that's actually certified equipment. We protect the aircraft as much as possible with a device called the AIRWORTHINESS 7509 AID, or Aircraft Interface Device. And that basically protects the airplane interfaces from the EFB, so the EFB can't corrupt the onboard systems. And that includes, by the way, off-board communications. We've already seen in the past that EFB data can endanger the aircraft. In this case, it was a takeoff performance requirement that came down. So it's serious stuff we have to pay attention to. I'm glad to say that I don't see a lot of these reports in the marketplace, so it's standing up well. Going forward, we're trying to perhaps move some of that application support into servers on board the aircraft. This is work that's ongoing now within the AWC. You can see two project papers, 679 and 834A, that are trying to get into that. Continuing airworthiness. Just because you designed the aircraft and delivered it doesn't mean that it's going to be secure for its lifetime. And so you have to worry about the measures you put in place. Are they suitable? Are they adapting to new attacks correctly, or are there changes that need to be made? Is the trustworthiness achieved as you expected? And we're worried about the keys. How are the keys being distributed and so forth? I'll finish with this. This is a Trojan horse, a version of a Trojan horse. And the reason I bring it up is we've talked a lot about all these barriers and all of these effects, but you can attack from the inside as well, and that gets to software loading. And so we have to worry about software loading as well as a significant threat to information security. Thank you.